I'm Dave Riley from That's Riley and Gentlemen, which I guess none of you have heard of, except for this dude here with the mustache. I'm a podcaster. I'm a games critic. I write for sites like Anime News Network, write for Otaku USA Magazine, and we're here to talk to you about video games.
Well, Dave gets his notes. I'll introduce myself. My name is Ajay Chaudhary. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Comparative Literacy and Society at Columbia University. I'm also the director of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. And for me, I'm actually preparing a class I'm going to teach on video games and criticism that will probably come sometime in the fall or winter. So I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, so we're going to talk about journalistic criticism, we're going to talk about academic criticism, we're going to talk about the issues with which we're both, and what we can do to make it a little better. So I want to start out by asking you guys a question. Are video games art?
Yeah.
Oh, that's actually the first reaction I didn't expect. I was thinking maybe you got quiet, maybe you laughed. I told myself I wouldn't care, but now I realize I do.
It was like the first 2 pages of my notes.
Yeah, we did not write exactly in tandem. All right, so video games, as we understand the sort of mainstream review follows, kind of a schematic. So you've got an introduction where they say something sort of like, this is a game for gamers, made by gamers, who are gamers. And then we cut it down to the graphics paragraph. It says, oh, you know, this game's got resolution, it's got frame rate, it's got explosions, and we drop it down to the part what you shoot bullets at kids. Here's the paragraph which says, oh, you know, the M16 in this gun's got a sound suppressor, and the grenade holds 3 bullets, and when you shoot enough guys, you level up. And then you got this little tiny part that I made it that small on purpose. But it says, also, this game is a complicated reconstruction of Call of Duty style games that, while not perfect, really shows with sharp relief the reasons why we play these games. So comparatively, compared to the graphics paragraph, compared to the gameplay paragraph, we don't spend a lot of time talking about things like that. And then finally we have the score. And we see
7.5, I am not buying that game.
5. That's too low. If I came home with a 7.5, my mom would beat my ass. And then it's not enough that we have a score. We have to break it down. So we say graphics, 7. Shoot bits, they're all right, 6.5. Reconstructing war shooters, well, that's 7.2.
Don't trust your averaging algorithm.
It never does, my friend. I appreciate your input, but the overall score is not an average. And if I had my brothers, there wouldn't be scores at all, but this is the world we live in. So as an example, I'm going to use the recently released Spec Ops: The Line, which is the deconstructing war games game that I was talking about in that mock review. So the idea is that Spec Ops: The Line is this average, everyday shooter, but it's actually a bit more clever than that. It starts out as a Call of Duty style, soldiers are going in to shoot Arabic people, and ends up as a really complicated anti-war shooter. So the issues when you're trying to discuss something like that is this non-holistic review structure. Adhering to a formula is stifling. If you have to spend 3 paragraphs talking about gameplay, if you have to spend a paragraph reiterating that this, like almost every mainstream game released on the market, has okay frame rates, has fine sound effects. You know, the center channel is really strong. That's what you might hear in a video game review, which I think holds limited value. So you got, your graphics paragraph, your sound paragraph, and there's a lack of critical literacy. So something like Spec Ops: The Line, we think of it as inspired by Heart of Darkness, Apocalypse Now, this sort of man reverting to a primeval state, people disappearing into the jungle, forming up these private armies. And Heart of Darkness was not a PlayStation 1 game. It was a novel game. So how can we need to discuss these things without reinventing the wheel? So this dialogue has already been created. Heart of Darkness was a book that was written 100 years ago. These themes exist, and if we want to talk about them with regards to a video game, we need to recognize that this stuff has been around for a while. So we can't use this single overriding format, which is obsessed with, like I said, resolution, frame rate. What does having a 5.0 for graphics do for a critical piece about Spec Ops? The score underlines the text. It serves a market purpose, which you guys probably know about Metacritic. That doesn't really help us. That's not something for us. That's something for companies to determine what bonuses or their employees get or do not get, which is more often the case. There's a primary focus on mechanical elements. Why do you have to devote a more than cursory attention to features? Spec Ops, any Spec Ops, if you podcast about Spec Ops The Line, you're going to spend 15 minutes talking about like, oh, you know, this gun felt all right. When I shot the guy in the head, he died. When I shot him in the chest, I had to shoot him 3 times. Probably the more interesting questions are, you take that, and I didn't see a podcast say, you know what, in Heart of Darkness, which most or all of you probably read in high school or college, there's a huge concern that there are black characters throughout that work, the Africans, who have literally no language, never speak a line of dialogue. Like so, the Emiratis in Spec Ops The Line, it takes place in Dubai, speak Farsi, which is not the language that is commonly spoken in Dubai. So they are literally stripping their language. Likewise, you know, these bullet point summations, like the good, the bad, the ugly, you know, when you're in a helicopter, the frame rate wasn't super great. That really, it limits the critical weight that your text can have. Additionally, when we're reinventing this wheel, people say, you know, X, Y, Z, amazing thing this game did, and we can be impressed by that, but we also should know, or at least be willing to look up, that these ideas have existed in philosophy forever, almost literally forever. I'm going to talk about which is Ajay. So, what do? When we talk about Spec Ops, we don't bother with the self-reflective stuff. We don't talk about how this is a game that says, it starts out, you shoot arrows for 45 minutes, and you say, well, this is a video game where I'm shooting arrows for 45 minutes. And then things change. And it stops being about that and starts asking you, the player, why do we play video games like this? And how do we write a review about that? You know, in the mainstream media, we really can't. We'll throw in one throwaway line that says, you know, story was pretty good. It became pretty complex. So there's this artificial concern with certain parameters. We talk about commercial performance as aesthetic quality. We say Call of Duty sold, I don't know, 23 million, it says there for Call of Duty by now. So that must be pretty great. And that's what we think of when we think of like an objective review. Like, if a game sold 23 million copies, you know, 23 million people must not be wrong. And there are probably a couple of people in there who broke the disc and called it 21 million. It's all the same. And we're also terrified of spoilers, which is another way to really limit discussion. You know, we can't talk about BioShock harvesting the little sisters because that might be a spoiler. Well, you know, spoilers, there are mainstream reviews and there are pieces of criticism. And the primary issue is that what we consider the big sites and what gets the most popularity doesn't really make a distinction between the two. So there isn't a real space to talk about things that affect you in a game other than mechanics, which is why we spend so much time on mechanics, because most people don't consider the fact that there's a grenade launcher 3/4 of the way through the game to be a spoiler. But that means that 10 years in, I still can't talk about the ending of Fatal Frame 2, which is pretty awesome, but you never know. So, furthermore, there's a lack of attention to social criteria, or worse, a backlash to people who try. For example, you want to write a review about Lollipop Chainsaw, what would you say? You would say there were some parts where she cut zombies with a chainsaw. And that's the only thing you're allowed to say. And that's a real issue, because if you go off the record, or if you go off course, people are sure they want to give you a stern drubbing about it. They want to say, well, why are you talking about sexism in this game? Well, the reason I bring it up is because when I rescue a character in this game, when a high school student is held captive by zombies, and he says, thanks for rescuing me, I'm going to masturbate to you tonight. I mean, that's not me bringing it up, that's the game bringing it up. But because there's this idea in sort of nerd culture that we can't say anything that might offend somebody, we just don't say anything at all. And then we talk about mechanics for 3 paragraphs, and we have to write a review of Lollipop Chainsaw that says, yeah, you know, there's like an XXY combo that's pretty good, but the XXXY combo is a little better. It takes like half the game to get it. When really, I want to talk about the fact that there is a boss in that video game who literally instantiates words like slut and whore in the air, and then attacks your character with that. And maybe that's really smart, because they say sticks and stones will break my bones. And so maybe it's playing off that. Or maybe it's a bunch of guys who just want to put a lot of profanity in the game. And the only way to decide which case it is to talk about these things. But, the problem is that when you do that, a lot of people on the internet say, shut up, I just want to read the score. Which makes it hard. So, it's hard to have people say, it's just a game, man. And we need active engagement, which means participating in a conversation. So you absolutely do want feedback. But you want feedback that it doesn't have to agree with you, but it should do something to further the conversation. And saying, shut up, I don't want to hear about this, doesn't really further anything. So you might say, well, that's interesting, I disagree, and here's why. And we prefer that immensely to just the entire internet being quiet, or worse, saying, I'd rather see a top 10 list. I'd rather see top 10 lists if you got to save from castles. So, yeah, this adversarial fan and critic relationship, which can be a problem because in this internet era, everyone is, including me, which is how I got my start. So we just have to accept this with a bit of maturity, and we have to say, we can't say, don't call video games not art, Roger Ebert, out of one side of our mouth, when out of the other side of our mouth we're saying, yeah, but shut up when you're talking about boobs, because I just like hearing about boobs in video games. And I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm not saying there shouldn't be games about boobs. I'm just saying that maybe you could talk about them when it happens.
That's the blind slide.
I've only been public for 10 minutes. I know you've got longer than that, I think I skipped a lot.
Well, we got some. Come back. All right, so I'm going to pick up a little bit where David was
wait, I know what I'm saying. Oh, sorry. So what do we do?
This is why I did animation.
Secret animations, but you're going to like this one. So let's stop rehashing finished conversations. We don't need to tell Roger Ebert every 6 months the video games are horrible.
Although I'm about to do so in 5 minutes.
But really,
Yeah.
and we don't need to justify ourselves, because I think the medium justifies itself, and I think you need to operate from that position of strength. Games are art. Let's just talk about it like they are. When you're shy at a party and it's hard to talk to people, you force yourself to be brave, and then eventually you stop having to force yourself and you just talk. So if you operate from a position of strength, you'll just get more things done. And video games don't exist in a vacuum. So films, TV, books, comics, paintings, even music, they all inform what we're talking about with video games. So we can't act like, wow, what a great game BioShock was, when Ayn Rand exists. And BioShock is a game about talking about Ayn Rand's philosophy. We can't say, wow, because they had all these people under the sea, and they were like all about themselves, man. Because there's already language out there for that, and it's called objectivism. And that's what BioShock is about. So we need to talk about BioShock with relation to Ayn Rand's works like Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged. We need to talk about how BioShock interprets objectivism, which is how Ayn Rand interprets objectivism, which is really the gay side of the conversation, the academic side.
Not specifically Ayn Rand.
Not today. But so that's sort of the point of it, is that criticism is weak because we don't really seem to allow ourselves a space for it. And I think probably a lot of other people do. And I think the way you get criticism is just force it a little. Just put that stuff out there and make it known that you want to read those things as well. And similarly, there are issues with academic criticism.
I'll sort of pick up there. Thanks, Steve. I agree with pretty much everything that Jay just said, frankly, about popular games criticism. And I wish I could say that academic games criticism was a lot better. Sadly, this is sort of not the case. When I was preparing to give this talk, I was like, Ajay, do not, write a long, crazy critical academic paper that's going to be really alienating and terrible. And what I ended up doing was writing a long, critical academic paper that was really alienating and terrible. So I'm going to try not to do that and try not to use too much jargon or anything like that. But I am going to do want to briefly sort of walk through the history of aesthetic thought and briefly walk through some ideas that were developed around games and gameplay in the sort of 20th century. So I am going to come back to this question that Dave started with, like what is art question. So in English parlance, we use art as a sort of modern category. Just like any number of other modern categories, we talk about like the state, or art, or economics, or politics, or religion. These are all things that are sort of modern ideas that you can find anticipants in history for. So for example, for the Greeks, the question, what is art, was, what is beautiful, right? So this is what like Plato, Aristotle, people like that were trying to get at. When Marcel Duchamp, in about 1917, took this urinal, put it on a pedestal in a gallery in New York, and was like, art, he pretty much made a pretty good statement against that what is beauty theory, and sort of exemplified a real shift in what was going on in art at the time, which was that in the modern era, the question had shifted from what is beautiful to actually what is art. And he was basically saying, look, it's whatever we discursively decide it is. So he's saying it, and you all can reject it, or you all could say it is what he says doesn't matter, but it's something that's going to happen between him and you all, him and the sort of the public. And in some ways, this is one of the only, I'm going to try not to do too much ancient Greek and too much German, but this is in some ways closer to the concept of aesthetikos, which really has to do with the human senses. Like, how do objects in the world affect us, and how do we affect objects in the world? And so he wasn't simply thumbing his nose at the establishment when he did this. He was really returning to this notion of aesthetics as things that deal with, the human senses. Incidentally, Duchamp, not too long after this, quit art altogether and devoted his life to becoming a master chess player because he considered the playing chips, not the formal aspects, not the color of the pieces or carving a really intricate set, but the game itself to be an art form. So that brings me to the Ebert thing, and we really will be quite quick. Because I just sort of want to table this, or like once and for all, sort of put this behind us. Because there's sort of two arguments that Ebert puts forward. I've sort of labeled them here A and B. One, the A version is that games do not elicit emotional responses. And the quote from Ebert, I'm sure you've heard this, is no one cries at level 7. And I'll address this in 1 second. And B is this idea that games can't be art because they're not written by a single author, right? Games are made by entire teams, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are both sort of ridiculous ideas. A can be refuted by massive empirical data, not just sort of emotional impact reported by players, but you can sort of look at psychological literature, but it can also be refuted by immanent critique, by which I mean like in Ebert's own terms. In his own medium of choice, film, we have countless examples of films that do not elicit this sort of maudlin sentimentality that Ebert designates in this like crying at level 7 thing as artistic, right? Not all films make you cry. Just because a film makes you cry, doesn't make you cry does not make it not art. In fact, many of the movies that are always considered sort of most interesting or most artistic, do not deal at that level of sort of base sentimentality. And I had some examples here. I was thinking of like very early, experimental films like Bertald's Man with a Movie Camera and things like that. But you can probably imagine your own sort of list of movies that don't deal with, aren't tearjerkers, that are still art. So that sort of deals with question A. And I also think we all can sort of relate to emotional experiences in-game that perhaps deal with emotions that are more readily available to games. Sort of confusion, frustration, exhilaration, things like that, that maybe are less associated with a kind of experience. And B, the auteur theory stuff can be refuted without even resorting to sort of the very famous notion by Roland Barthes about the death of the author. Just because, for example, we live in an age where countless art forms, comic books, television shows, come quickly to mind, but films themselves too are explicitly socially written. They're written by multiple people. Novels and studio art being paintings, statuary, whatever, they actually stand out. They're the standouts. Like things like theater, dance, think of like orchestras, things like that are inherently social. There's always more than one person involved. And this idea that that like art is the romantic single vision of like the great poet out in the, facing the ocean and being like, why God, why? It's sort of ridiculous. And Ebert should know that because I know he knows how to read. And people have been talking about these things for a really long time.
Now 5 minutes longer.
Yeah, now, okay.
But it's done.
That's it, it's done. No more Ebert.
We beat Ebert.
All right, so academic games criticism. Like I said before, sadly, I would love to report that academic games criticism is this ocean of amazing stuff that's hidden behind paywalls of academic journals. But I am sad to say that although there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, it's lacking quite a bit as well. So the first thing I'll say about this is that it isn't really games criticism. It's not because it's not actual work, it's just that none of it operates as critical theory. It's mostly about game design or theory of game design, neuropsychology, and this you're probably very familiar with because it's stuff that makes it into the news where it's like shooting guns, the game makes you into a game killer, which is ridiculous.
Erotic weaponry.
Exactly, the Mass Effect 1 rape simulation game. And or just basic engineering. These are all incredibly important things, right? I would not want to live in a world in which there were not journals devoted to coding and engineering, but this is not going to get us all the way.
Yeah, well, that sort of data is necessary. You talked about previously emotional response.
Yeah.
They hook up electrodes to people's heads and see what makes them sad when they play a video game, or what makes them happy.
Right, and that when I was talking about before empirical data, I was actually thinking of that. There isn't terribly much difference between a brain scan of someone playing a video game and someone watching film. So most of these disciplinary approaches, as I said, they sort of further the perspective and insight of game designers, vis-a-vis the language, terms, and positions of game designers. They could be a wide range of topics, it can be anything on music or on visual effects in games, but they're very, very infrequently about the relationship between games and game players. I don't like the term gamers, but I don't let's say we need to say. To be reductive about this would be like writing workshops as opposed to writing for literature courses. I already said this one. Oh, the last kind of I talked about social psychological. The last thing I want to talk about is this sort of new gamification utopian political movement. I find this to be yet another designer's literature. You guys probably have seen some. Raise your hand if you've seen gamification.
Jay McConaughey.
Right. So this is the idea that we turn our work lives into games, or our private, or sort of
you give yourself 5 points for doing the dishes.
Yeah.
10 points for getting up on time. 3 points for brushing your teeth.
Right. We were talking about this earlier. If you actually think about what's it called? Your gamer score on Xbox. That's the gamification of games. So you're actually playing games to score points. It's like a meta game. And some sort of what I call utopian game theorists have been well, if we could just turn work into a game, then everyone
would fix the whole world.
Wouldn't
we get rid of pollution if people got 50 points for cleaning up pollution?
The answer is no.
Well, the problem is that this encourages this perpetual state of adolescence, which nothing is worth doing for the sake of doing it. Everything is worth doing because there's an award tacked on it again. And I think there's sort of nothing more illustrative to this fact than Jane McGonigal herself, who, after suffering a head injury of some kind, she had a concussion. She invented a game called Super Better to make sure that she would do the things she needed to do to recover from this injury. And one of the things she had to do was she would give herself X amount of points, 30 points, for checking in with her friends every 2 hours. Well, when you have a concussion, people need to check on you to make sure you don't die. So the incentive of not dying was not enough. 20 points on top of that, otherwise it didn't count. And you can draw an immediate parallel to that, though it's a little less severe with any of you, and maybe there's 1 or 2 of you guys in the audience that rented the Avatar game for Xbox because you knew you could get all 1,000 points in 5 minutes. So the playing of the game, you're playing your own game, and maybe you like that game, but you should recognize that this is a different layer.
And I actually maybe even take that a step further or a step in a different direction, but I actually have in my notes here, this is a 21st century attempt at Fordism. You know, Henry Ford used to make these designs in his factories, essentially so that, like, he's like, well, if I have a worker that has one arm and no legs, you know, how can I still extract 9 hours of work out of them? It's like, well, if I design a certain system, I can still do it. And like, this is like, you know, Stalin looked at this and was like, that's what we got to be doing. And this field, it's all about extracting as much work out of the people as possible, which to me seems to run quite up against the idea, of course, of play, which is what games are about. So, playing, games, critical theory for games. How much?
We got plenty.
Oh, great. All right, so I have two quotes up here, one of which I hope is one of which I think is probably pretty familiar, and one of which is probably less familiar, but I'll read them both. One is from Arthur C. Clarke: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And the second one is from Theodore Adorno to Walter Benjamin. These are two 20th century Frankfurt School theorists, sort of mid-20th century German Jewish philosophers who were interested in sort of both like sort of materialist critique, but also in like art theory and things like that. And what Adorno said to Benjamin after reading a bunch of his work, particularly some of the work I'm going to talk about right now, was your work has situated itself at the crossroads of positivism and magic. By positivism, he didn't really mean positivism as like logical positivism, which I don't really need to go into. And by magic, he didn't really mean magic. But but we'll get into that. And he was very offended because Adorno was very much a believer in sort of high culture, low culture, and Benjamin was someone who thought Mickey Mouse was very interesting. We get from. Oh, let me turn my page. All right, so we get from Benjamin this term Spielraum, and I'll show you where it comes from. It comes from the German Spielen, and in German, Spielen means both games and play. So it's games and play at the same time. And Benjamin thought that games and play were integral to human experience. And this is not, they sort of form the basis of the habits that we then act out in our whole lives. So there's a little bit of childhood theory as well, but he's also talking about adults. And this isn't habits in the sense that we think about now, like a bad habit, like smoking, etc. But in fact, like anything that we do, the repetition that we do is sort of based on an idea of play if there's any sense of pleasure in it. And so it's not that we literally ate what we do in games, but we do learn through them. We learn through rule sets of images, relations, and all manner of activities. And sort of in the repetition, there comes pleasure. Make sure that goes sleep. Thanks. One of the things that was really different about Benjamin than many of his contemporaries, and in fact many of my counterparts in the humanities today, was that he was intensely fascinated with technology. Now I say this, with a little bit of hesitation, just because fascinated doesn't mean he was in love with technology or that he lived in great fear of it. The sort of technological optimists of his day, sort of orthodox Marxists, were essentially like, look, if we can, this goes back to sort of, we were talking about gamification a second ago, but we're like, look, if we just have the right technology, eventually we'll get a technological system that will fix the world and everything will become hunky-dory. They were sort of super into technology. And then other people like sort of Heidegger or Junger, these sort of very conservative 20th century German thinkers, were like, and you're probably familiar with this because this is sort of seeped into culture in a very strong way, were like, technology is somehow unnatural or inorganic. It is somehow hurting our basic human essence. These ideas that I find somewhat ridiculous, and so did Benjamin, for the very obvious notion that everything is natural, everything is material, we're all part of the material world, etc., etc. I have a lot that I could talk about here, but I'm actually going to skip a little bit of it just straight to get to this history of dialectic thought. The last thing that I think is really important for understanding where games criticism can come from is understanding how previous philosophic thinkers have thought about art. And the dialectic method is one of the ways in which people have done that. For Plato and Socrates, this was very simply like, you sort of have a definition, I ask you a question, and we sort of work it out from there until eventually we sort of dig to the bottom, and we find out, the true form of what it actually is. And Hegel had a more modern version of this, where the sort of crass version that everyone always says, and I'm going to do now, even though I know it's reductive, is essentially you put forward a thesis, and its antithesis develops, so P and not P. And then they are both overcome and somehow sort of combined and negated, and a new thing emerges, and then the process happens again, and so on. Now, Benjamin's version of this was a little bit different. He wanted to have to go through a thorough critique of the object, through the art object or the technology, or whatever he's dealing with. Understand that the social forces, the economic forces, the natural forces, all the things that went into creating that object and sort of constituting that object, but still holding on to the sort of dream image, what he called the dream image, the sort of creative possibility in it. So I've been drawing on sort of his most famous essay, which is called The Work of Art, Image, and Mechanical Reproduction. And the reason I want to draw this out is that, and this quote is actually from an earlier version. So I'll get to that in a moment. But the thing that he noted was that in medieval art, and please, this is our, but in medieval art, the viewer was not the sort of the mass public. The person who was going to see the art, the person who was going to interact with the art, and all art is in some ways interactive. So interactivity is something we should talk about as well. But I have these two examples here of sort of the interiors of cathedrals. People would actually build statuaries and windows and paintings that no one could ever see. This was a very different idea of the world. Most art was sort of squirreled away in churches or in houses or palaces of the aristocracy, and the idea of exclusivity lent the objects a certain kind of aura. And again, I don't want to definitely in scare quotes. It's not like aura, like I'm going to read your aura. It's not Shirley MacLaine is the aura woman, right? It's not that. It's more of a sense of a sort of dramatic distancing, right? I'm never, if I'm, some peasant or some guild member in medieval Europe, I'm never probably going to see a work of art unless I make it myself. Benjamin sort of pointed out, well, in our age, and he was talking about the 30s, we run off lithographs and prints of the Mona Lisa, 100 copies of, in 10 minutes. And so, in fact, that's not the way we encounter art at all anymore. And in fact, that kind of distancing is completely erased. And what it gets replaced with is what he called Spielraum, which is literally room for play or space for play. And he thought that this was a very, very sort of progressive and interesting formulation. This is what so shocked his colleagues and made them quite angry, because he was saying, look, there could be look, I know that these sort of very classical art forms are being destroyed or transformed, but there's an extraordinary chance for creative play to emerge out of this. So I'm going to try to sort of apply really quickly the kind of theory that I have outlined here, drawing on a few other ideas to a couple of recent games, and see if you can sort of synthesize what kind of games criticism I would like to talk about. So the first game I want to talk about is Fez, and I'm going to call this the re-enchantment thesis, because in fact, one of the things that happened within 20th century sociology and late 19th and early 20th century sociology was this very long thing that I'm not going to read from Max Weber here, but this idea that as we institutionalize and rationalize and come to understand things, as we just talked about with art, right, it becomes accessible, it becomes knowable, it sort of ruins the fun. It disenchants the world, right? And this is actually a very, very bad thing for these sociologists. And in Fez, you guys might recall, raise your hand if you played Fez. Probably not. Oh.
That's what I would have thought.
Well, it's a really good game. I highly recommend
You're
it.
a little platformer dude, jumping around, rotating the world.
It's, yeah. So there's this particular moment in Fez where you see what you can see here, which is those little QR codes you can scan with your iPhone in the game. Now, I was playing this, and I've read other people sort of similar sort of stories about this, and I know the plural of anecdote is not data, but we're just working for a foundation here, not the finished product. But yeah, so you're sitting there and you're like, well, that looks like a QR code. They couldn't possibly actually want you to walk over to the TV and scan this thing. But that, in fact, is precisely what they want you to do. They want you to get up and you do this. And this sort of dramatically changes the game space. So what's happening here is not, again, this ties in directly with some of the things Dave was talking about. This is not about graphics. This is not about the frame rate of things.
It's also not even about gameplay.
It's not even really about gameplay. It's about this crazy thing where they thought of this sort of way in this sort of fun use of the word magic, right? To enchant the space of the room that you were in, right? So all of a sudden, things that you thought were not involved in the game your phone. This is not actually the phone that I use. But nonetheless, your phone, the house that you're in, the people you're with are suddenly all part of the game, and you don't know what can happen. It's incredibly extraordinary, and you have this feeling of what I call a re-enchantment. So this is Fez, the re-enchantment thesis. And this is one of the things we can sort of talk about that games do.
Well, it takes you, so you take a picture with your camera, which I didn't even know how to do. I'd never taken a picture of a QR code before, I'd seen them on the subway for bed bugs. So I take a picture with my camera, and I look at my camera, and there's just a picture on the screen, and I'm just lost. So we find out, okay, so you need an app. Take a picture of it. You take a picture, and then it gives you a code, which is on the screen there.
Yeah.
RTRTLP, which you immediately interpret. You realize that's the triggers. You push the triggers, and it gives you a happy little sound, and you solve the puzzle. And yeah, that integrates a different space, and it's also a completely different mode of thinking that you might be used to. And Fez is just replete with these things. There's a moment where you're looking at a telescope, and you see two stars blinking in the distance. So you think, okay, maybe that's Morse code. So you try and hit the buttons like a long and a short button hit. No. You figure out slowly that it's left and right. You have maybe a 3-minute window to do this, because there's a day-night cycle. So there's 3 minutes a night and 3 minutes a day. So we're sitting there, trying to punch in the code, trying to write it down, like left, right, on actual paper, which like you might remember playing games, maybe not a lot of you guys, in like the 1980s, where you were like crawling through a dungeon and you had to draw a map on a piece of paper. So it brings that, it brings the physical space back into your game. So we're writing down on a piece of paper.
Right, as I wrote it, yeah.
Yes. And none of that works too. So we say, all right, we're getting sick of this waiting for 3 minutes while daytime is and we can't see the stars. So I'm going to take a video with my iPhone, and we're going to record the video, and then we're going to rip that video apart, and we're going to figure out what this pattern is. And it turned out we were completely overanalyzing. What the video game wanted us to do was click the left trigger when the left star was blinking, and the right trigger when the right star was blinking. And it was basically just saying, here, play Guitar Hero for like 5 seconds. But the realization of our own stupidity was also sort of tactical.
Well, because the game had done things like this already, you were not like crazy to think that that was what it wanted to do then either. Okay, my second example of Portal. This is Portal 1. I think it's a better game than Portal 2. We can talk about that some other time. And I call this the structural critique thesis. I didn't say this for a few reasons. Portal is sort of like a lot of creative games, a game about games. But it plays out by requiring the player to learn and unlearn a set of rules and patterns and learning and developing others. And this is best exemplified by the scene you guys. I'm going to do this each time every game. Anyone play Portal? Everyone play Portal? More or less? Okay, yes. All right. Oh, yes. Oh, God. This whole talk is spoilers.
It's right in the middle. It came out 5 years ago.
All right, well, I already spoiled you a bunch on Fez. I'm going to spoil you a lot in Portal.
It's just the middle part.
I'm going to spoil a lot in a lot of things. Anyway, whatever, it happens.
If you didn't play the end of Metal Gear Solid 4, that might be a concern.
Yeah, anyway, this is, so there's a scene, right, in Portal. God, I feel kind of guilty, actually. This is what you were talking about, the fear of spoilers.
Spoilers, man.
Oh, man. All right, so there's a scene where you are on a sort of conveyor belt going into fire. And this sort of increasingly strange and psychotic GLaDOS, the computer who's been speaking to you the whole time, is telling you to sort of, no, this is fine, it's not, I forget exactly what you said, it's like not real fire.
It's the birthday party vacation here.
Yeah. Like
and that's where the kids come from.
Yeah.
And don't worry because all amateur science equipment is operational.
Yeah, I'll get at the for science thing, I think it's fucking fantastic. Fantastic. I can say curse.
Right, a little blue.
Okay, so if you as a player instinctively know this is a very bad idea, right? So you're like, I'm going to go into fire. But the whole game you've been following her instructions, even though you can tell she's kind of insane. And it doesn't really matter if you jump off right there or if you died 7 times before you figured out to jump off right there. But in that moment, you realize that you have to do something against what you've been conditioned to do. And the only way to do that is to utilize all the other stuff the game has taught you how to do then against the logic that the game has given you. This is a sort of extraordinary thing. So the game is talking about games, but it's also talking about the ways in which sort of social structures exist in general, right? And so the only way we can deal with structural critique is by using other things we learn through structural critique. And this is a sort of really, really extraordinary thing that only, I think, not only, but like is very, very powerful in games as a possibility in games. And there's still, of course, a meta-critique that the game is still a game. So even when you jump off the conveyor belt, you're still technically playing a video game. Valve knew you were going to do that. Again, that's not that important, and we'll get to why later. I put at the bottom here dialectic enlightenment, and I am not giving a big bibliography. If anyone wants one, I'll happily give you one. But that there is this wonderful other structural critique that comes out of a game like Portal, where it is so openly, and again, this is almost like what you were talking about with Lollipop Chainsaw. The text itself is pointing out the ways in which, the for science, like GLaDOS is a perfect science machine. It is going to keep on running experiments until experiments, there are no more experiments, whether or not that destroys the world or kills all the people or not. This sort of shows the unreason of sort of pure science, and so I loved that sort of campaign for Portal 2, because I actually think it pointed to even a second aspect of the structural critique that you could do, and I linked that up to Dr. Enlightenment, which is a wonderful book, and we can talk about that maybe afterwards. Okay, Journey. This is my third example. I call this the communicative action thesis, and I'm not going to explain communicative action. I'm not going to explain this very long quote from Jürgen Habermas here. Again, if you want to talk about that with me later, I'll happily do so, but I think if I read this, it will be annoying to everyone. But essentially, the sort of strictures of communication, I'm not going to ask you if one play Journey, whatever. I'm not giving any spoilers away. There are these strictures to the co-op in Journey, where the communication apparatus is so stripped down that there's a sense, and the interaction between characters in the co-op is so stripped down, is so restricted, that griefing is impossible.
Well, you should lay out that in this game, you're a little person who wanders around the world, and your sole interaction with the world is you can push a button to sing a little song.
Right.
One piece of a song.
You can sing it loudly or softly. You can sing it in like little chirps or in like bursts.
You can beat out Morse code with it, sort of, but
Sort of.
that's sort of anti-good point.
Right.
But the point, so you're wandering around this world, and the game gives you partners at random. So it's not a game you play with your friends; it's a game you play with people on the internet, which is, I think, something that most civilized people don't want to do.
Yeah, except this game civilizes you, which might seem like a horrible thing.
Well,
but like,
it's not only that; it enforces civilization.
Yeah.
upon you.
And
civilization.
Even that is sort of a
Civil behavior.
There's a horrifying thought of being forced to be civil. Let's put it that way. I mean, that seems very sort of like colonial. But what is actually sort of happening here is sort of a kind of like limited language action. It's not really real language, right? So at the end of the game, you see a list of people that you play with, and they're from like Kyrgyzstan and Japan and all kinds of places where I definitely can't speak the language of the people there speak. And so I know I didn't really communicate with them in any actual linguistic human way. But I did have this sort of some kind of communicative action with them. And if you're familiar, this might be more interesting to me as someone who comes from a philosophy background, but if you're familiar with any sort of language philosophy, whether it be analytic or continental or whatever, the idea that we can actually communicate, like across these sort of cultural and linguistic boundaries, is so extraordinary as to be another kind of magic. And it really does, when you see that credit sequence roll at the end of Journey, I really do think you're sort of put into this space where you're like, oh my God, I actually did have some kind of communication experience with these people. Like one of the things that happens in the co-op, for example, is someone who's played the game before will sort of go to one side of the little chamber and chirp at you. And maybe they'll chirp loudly if you're going the wrong way, and chirp quietly, or chirp frequently, or get sort of flustered and jump around. And they do all kinds of things to get your attention, and you'll walk over there and you'll be like, oh, they're trying to show me that there's a hidden map over here. And you see it, and it's really interesting, and you get a nice little piece of your scarf, and it's nice to have a long scarf in this game, but I don't need to go into why that is the case. But in any case, what has happened is you've sort of overcome, or you've simulated overcoming this language barrier in an extraordinary way, which again I'm calling a sort of a pseudo kind of magical realism.
It's also, that game at the end contextualizes, I'm not 100% sure on this, but you've been passing these sort of obelisks along the way.
Yeah.
Which the game at the end suggests that every obelisk there represents another person, and maybe it's where another person died, or maybe it's just a person who completed the game. But it gives you this, I don't know, like this sort of profound sense of mortality when you see these things. Because when you're walking through, you're like, all right, these little piles of rocks, like maybe they are. But they are probably where people died, or, I mean, there's not a lot of death in Germany. But there probably were once real people here. It also reminds me of, there's a moment in Dark Souls where you're wandering around a sewer. Dark Souls is this action RPG that's renowned for being very deadly. You're wandering around a sewer, and you don't really, you're supposed to spend the whole game moving forward like an inch at a time. But the problem is that gets boring, and as you go a little faster, you make mistakes. So you're moving like a little bitty bit at a time. And you're like, I'm probably fine here. You know, well, I've been killing these rats, it's fine. And you walk right into like a little pit, and it drops you down a hole, and you're in a whole place you've never been before, and you just drop down a vertical shaft to get there. So you're like, you're already on edge because you've lost your exit, and that's sort of the only thing you can rely on in Dark Souls, is that if you run far enough, the monsters stop chasing you. So now you don't have that. You know that you have to go forward, and that's the only way out. And these like creepy little frogs with these giant bug eyes around the corner, and you're like, I mean, when I saw them, I had one of the most physical reactions I've ever had in a game before. Like, these giant googly eyes, like Furby style. That's not the point. The point is that you're wandering around this place, and there's these grotesque statuary, like these frozen people with spikes coming out of them, and when you roll into them, they blow up. Like the pots you roll into, like bookcases and stuff like that. Just stuff in the environment you can break. And then one of the frogs kills you by spraying this poison gas, and you turn into one of those statue people. And you realize that every one of those statue people is somebody that died down there. Yeah, which is exciting and weird.
It's exciting and weird, and we haven't thought it through.
Yeah.
All right, my fourth and final example, and I'm going to sort of spend a little bit longer on this one than the others, is perhaps, and this surprises you, Metal Gear Solid 4. And I say that perhaps this surprises you, is because I didn't want, the other three examples I gave, people could maybe be like, oh, you're making some kind of like arcane versus mainstream games argument, or some high culture versus low culture kind of argument, and I'm really not trying to do that. I've not been Dave is interested in doing that either.
I've never been.
Yeah, I don't think that's something
Either of us are
Like
interested in
pretty
doing.
brass stuff. Metal Gear Solid.
Well, I think Metal Gear Solid 4 is wonderful. I'm about to tell you why. I also think that Metal Gear Solid 4 deals with one of the fundamental flaws in the way that a lot of the scholarly approaches to understanding games, sort of game players and gameplay unfolds. And this question often arises, you've probably heard people talk about this before, right? So everyone's like, well, what makes games special? Well, interactivity. As I already said, almost all art is in some way interactive in one way or another. So it often turns into this question, which I think is a flawed question, of whether the players or the designers are the author of the game, or the author of the game meaning, or whatever. And I think that following the critique that I've been sort of outlining in a sort of very, 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 very vague way, if you want the paper, I can send it to you, gives us sort of other options of how to think about this. Even when games take on the appearance of an open world or a sandbox or a creative kind of game, there's usually some sense of boundaries or linearity that's outlaid by the designer. So linearity is at play. This only matters though, so game designers are obsessed, and a lot of game design theorists are obsessed with like, how can you get past this, and a lot of game, even sort of popular game critics will often be like, oh man, that game is fucking linear.
Yeah.
Like, that game's stupid. It's
Well, the
linear
example
game.
that people give in recent memory is Final Fantasy 13. Which is,
But that game was just bad.
yeah, that's the thing. The linearity is in what ruined Final Fantasy 13. It just wasn't a very fun game. Right?
Yeah, well, so as I said, this question only matters if all I care about is the authorial point of view. But the experience of the game player, I think, is much closer to the position, is not akin to someone who watches a film viewer, or a reader of a novel. I think these things are incredibly different. The experience of a game player is closer to someone who acts in a play or in a film, right? Like essentially the scriptures are there. And you have a certain amount of freedom, but it's also like, you know what's going to happen to Hamlet. Like, it doesn't change. It never changes. But that doesn't make the experience of playing Hamlet the same for every person. So that's where the text is generated. And this is sort of the same technological magic that Benjamin talked about that sort of transforms acting and sort of actors and acting in films. And he talks about this in his essays, about how sort of acting goes from sort of playing to the cheap seats theater thing to this incredibly weird thing in films where you see the most sort of minuscule, intimate motions of actors, and actors who have trained themselves to act in this way, acting for a fake eye, right, a technological eye.
Not only for the camera, but also for the lights.
Yeah,
for the dudes with the microphone.
Yeah, acting for an entire fantasy sort of set, but that becomes projected onto us into this sort of glorified, magnified way. And this was, in that time, in the 30s, was sort of an extraordinarily magical experience.
I mean, I read that the Hansen paper.
Yeah. So I'm drawing a lot
you're
on
referencing.
Miriam Hansen.
What she says is that, I'm trying to remember. It's been a couple ways. The film, it's like this complete deconstruction of a human being. Like into parts. Like here's the part that the lights affect, here's the part that the sound affect, which is just a different experience than what a play is.
Right.
Which you think it's probably more holistic, I guess.
It's just a different experience. I think it's holistic, but it's also different. It's a very different experience, and I don't think anyone would even say for a second that the feeling of watching a film and the feeling of watching a play are the same experience. That's not to say that there's a hierarchy of better and worse.
Well, if you want, think about the captains in Star Trek, Picard.
I thought you were talking about that documentary.
What's Cisco? They're like theater actors. And you can tell in the way they act compared to like Riker or some other, Kirk. They act differently. Even though
No, they do act extraordinarily differently, although I like Picard the best.
break down. Cisco's the best.
Deep Space Nine's the best, but Picard's the best. Is the best captain. And we'll get into this later. This is a different panel. So let me sort of give you what I think the exemplary moment in Metal Gear Solid 4 is to explain what I'm talking about. And this is super spoilery because it's like basically the end of the game. But there's the penultimate sequence in the game. You slash Snake, and this is something else I want to talk about, because you are not Snake. I think game players and game critics often sort of think the identification sort of moves in a much stronger direction than it does. But you are like the primary mover of Snake, to use a sort of old rationalist kind of language. So you want Snake to crawl across this bridge in an irradiated room. Now, this sequence, if I was using the language of sort of the literature, the academic literature of game design, this is a horrible sequence. And if I was doing the sort of popular critic thing of linearity, this would also be a horrible.
Like, where's the player choice?
Yeah.
Why can't I hit the microwave emitter to knock it out?
Yeah, I should be able to shoot it, right? I'm a Solid Snake, right? So in this sequence, the player is doing nothing but pressing X. You're pressing X. That's all you do in this scene, nothing else. You're advancing Snake upon a 100% predetermined on-rails path from point A to point B. From a design point of view, is literally like you are watching a movie and turning the projector, right? Well,
you can make
there'll be a Q&A. But I actually think that this perspective is highly flawed. Because my own experience, I know many other people report this experience. In fact, a lot of people in the popular literature talks about this experience of that part of the game is of an extraordinary exhilaration and fear. You're like, oh my God, Snake is not going to make it across this thing. I have to pound X as if my own life depended on it.
Well, this is something that you experienced in previous Metal Gear Solid.
Yes.
And in each of those torture sequences, you adopt a different position with your hands on the controller.
Right.
You want to be able to push the button as fast as you can. And that's different than if you were watching a movie of Solid Snake going down that thing, you wouldn't be like, oh, maybe this Snake's not going to make it. No, of course you would. So so it becomes irrelevant whether or not you can lose, and you probably can't. Neither of us know if you can.
I don't think you can actually lose that sequence. It just feels like you can. Okay.
But so even if you can, you what? You start at a checkpoint, and then you just do it again. So in the greater scheme of things, it still is irrelevant. But it doesn't feel that way. So is that unimportant?
Yes.
Because
It's because it lacks in this sort of player choice dimension. Is it unimportant? And I would say no. Because the player experience, the sort of like phenomenology of the gameplay, is one of in fact, exactly what we started this little sort of section of the talk at. It's exactly this emotional experience that Rodrigo would say it's impossible. And it's a kind of sort of magical realism in what is admittedly otherwise an absurdist text. I don't think the story of Metal Gear actually makes any sense. But it actually it's really extraordinarily good at sort of atmosphere and sort of thematic work.
it's also very good at making you examine what video games are about. You know, there's a chunk of this game where you go back to the first Metal Gear game, and you're going through the same areas, only now all the guards have been replaced by robots. But all the robots move like the guards did in the first games. You know, they walk up and they take a 90-degree turn and they walk over there. Which makes you think, you know, this is what video games were about 10 years ago when Metal Gear Solid 4 came out. And now we have Metal Gear Solid 1. Now we have these guys that like, you know, get nervous. Like if you think about like Batman's Arkham Asylum games, guys get scared.
Yeah.
Like when you pick off a couple of the dudes and then dudes start getting scared. Where Metal Gear Solid 1 is like, who's and then you get bored. Like, oh man, you know, there wasn't anybody behind this vent, so I guess I'm just going to go back to my patrol pad.
Right, and so, yeah, the Metal Gear Solid 4 doesn't have anything to
There's also actually, if I can interject, you guys are probably familiar with the website 1up.com. They have become a pretty good space for criticism in the past couple of months. They've had a bit of a leadership shakeup. And they just put out an article about Metal Gear Solid 4, which really, it dissects the economy of the game, which is you have a little robot pal who goes around and hoovers up all the guns and then sells them to your gun merchant dude who looks like Cisco. Not the captain, aforementioned, but the rapper. And so it dissects that idea of like in the beginning of the game, you are, where in other games you might ignore the dudes entirely, in this one you are going out of your way to knock them out or kill them or whatever, but you want those guns. And it makes you question that, and then later in the game, it stops giving, it's got this, you know, tenuous idea that this little robot pal here is bringing the guns back to Cisco and giving you money. Later on, you know, it starts giving you these Cisco points for like examining memory in the game space. So it changes this war economy, which is, you know, the oft-repeated phrase in that game, right. War economy. It changes the war economy into the snake economy. And it makes you examine like, okay, why am I, as a player, like going after these points? I don't need them. Like,
Right,
you don't need a gun in Metal Gear Solid. You never have.
Right, you can get through the whole game.
You got the tranquilizer pistol, and that's the only thing you need. So I wish I remembered that name in COVID, but if we have the PowerPoint after the presentation, I'll include it. But it's just another thing we're thinking about in Metal Gear. Just in general, Metal Gear Solid games are replete with those sort of ideas that sort of get washed over because people say like, ha ha ha, like 25-minute cutscene. Like when we were beating Metal Gear Solid 2, we were at the end of the game, we'd ordered pizza. I said, we'll get the pizza after this cutscene. An hour and 15 minutes later, the dude said, are you guys going to come pick up this pizza? I said, we're almost there. You didn't get it. Solid snake. You have to beat him.
Okay, so yes, so Metal Gear Solid. So I've been only talking about the sort of good side of this critique so far, but I do want to sort of be frank and give some of the bad as well. I do think, this will make sense in a second, please don't just think I'm putting scary pictures up on the board, but I do think both popular and academic games criticism, not all, by the way, and I really don't want to come off as seeming like I'm dismissing all academic games criticism. There's a lot of really good work, it's just not necessarily upholding this critical humanistic component that I think is so important. But a lot of the academic and popular criticism turns a blind eye to sort of economic forces that go into production. They ignore implications, Dave talked about this earlier, for the reproduction of cultural values and norms, even while they want to be respected as cultural mediums. In my opinion, and I know this might not be a very popular one, I mean, I'd say like 90%, the vast majority of games are replete with repugnant images, ideologies, implications, exploitations both of other people, but also of gamers themselves, of game players. as to so crowd out or otherwise forestall the possibility, the creative possibility of exploration of games as an art form. This may seem to sort of re-inscribe the kind of dichotomies I was talking about before, as like art, games versus talking games or something like that. But I think this is really a question of where the game text becomes so overbearing. And I'm thinking here of games like Gears of War, Modern Warfare, things like that, Age games, which essentially collapse dialectical possibility.
I saw this last night. Do you know what an H game is?
Well, yes.
It's all we've got to be comprehensive.
I'm going to try to wrap up and see we're out of time. Basically, where Benjamin ended that essay that I was talking about before was like, look, he wasn't unaware that film could be used for nefarious purposes as well. And he talks about sort of fascist use of film, which on the right you see Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. But that doesn't mean, what it means is that we as critics need to encourage the kind of thing on the left, which is actually one of Benjamin's favorite films, The Great Dictator by Charlie Chaplin, which in fact is a very politically active and wonderful film, many of the same images, but in which we've sort of turned everything on its head through sort of this sort of space for play that I've been talking about. So I really think that while we're advancing sort of the art of video games, we need to encourage creative play and not sort of fascist indoctrination. And
There's a Tom Bissell article. It's about Spec Ops: The Line. That is not the only video game I've played. I'm sorry for bringing it up. But in it he says, I think you could probably argue pretty successfully that the Call of Duty series has had a negative effect on human life. And I think that's true in probably a variety of ways. When you play Modern Warfare 2, you drive around in Afghanistan, a city in Afghanistan, where you're looking at civilians from like behind your gun in your Humvee. But as soon as the terrorists start shooting you, there are no more civilians, which is sort of weird and not like a good message. And similarly, I think that the progressive system that Call of Duty has in its multiplayer there's issues with that. It encourages you to do things that aren't playing the game, which I think is kind of a problem. That's a different conversation. So he says, sometimes I wonder how the people who make Call of Duty sleep at night. When I can't sleep at night, I play Call of Duty.
So I guess one of the final questions, and I think we are really out of time, so I will just sort of say it, is like, one of the things that criticism should tell us is wrong. Like, we should explore like, why are we doing things we don't necessarily want to do, what is happening in games, and none of this has anything to do with bullet point reviews.
Yes. It doesn't matter, what they have
gamification or
the accuracy. If what's his name, Nathan Drake has to shoot you in the head 3 times. Hey man, how come I gotta shoot you in the head 3 times? You only takes 1 bullet.
It does have to do, however, with Nathan Drake murdering the shit out of so many people.
That's a different question.
Okay.
Well, are we done?
I think
are we
we're
done.
done.
Push time? We got to stop. All right. Thanks for coming. Everybody.
If you're interested in
Well, you can find, you just Google Fast Karate, it's probably the easiest way. So fastkarate.net, our podcast, my podcast. It's a joke.